requires us to have a prompt payment provision. Our prompt payment provision says that the contractor has to pay for subcontract work within 10 calendar days after receiving payment from KDOT. All right? You as a subcontractor should not have to wait for 50 days, 60 days, 90 days for payment. Our contract says as a sub, you're paid within 10 days of the contractor receiving payment. And the contractor has to certify to KDOT that the contractor did pay the subcontractor. And that certification is, again, required by the contract. And the contractor says, I certified that on this day I paid. If the contractor falsifies that certification or doesn't pay, there are sanctions for failure to pay. And if you look at the next page that I handed out, or I didn't, I'm sorry, that's where we get to, I didn't, because when I copied it, I just copied the special provision. Go to page 81, please. 109.7 in our specification says that if the contractor doesn't pay the subcontractor within 10 days of getting payment from KDOT, and again, you don't have this contract provision. You might have a similar one. There should be, most governmental entities are required by statute to pay within a certain period of time. KDOT, as a state agency, we have to pay within 30 days of delivery of service. Now, we pay more often. You know, we have a contract provision. You can commit to paying more often, but we have a general statutory obligation. Most of your local entities do as well. So we pay the contractor, and then the contractor has the obligation to pay the subs. Now, what happens if the subcontractor doesn't get paid within 10 days? What's your right as a subcontractor? You haven't been paid. So you know KDOT issued a payment voucher on January 1 to the contractor, and it is February 1, and you haven't received payment. What should you do? Make a call. Thank you. Make a call. First of all, you got to know what your contract right is. All right? There's a provision here that says the contractor is to pay in 10 days. Do you know how many subcontractors I've talked to that didn't know that they were required to be paid in 10 days? Too many. Too many. I mean, this is your livelihood. All right? So, and again, this is all subs, not just, this doesn't say DBE subcontractors entitled to payment. This is all subcontractors, right? So if the contractor doesn't pay, there's things KDOT can do, and there's things that we do allow you as the subcontractor to seek. All right, so what are those? All right. If the contractor doesn't have good cause, if they don't pay and they don't have good cause, we'll talk about that in a minute, right? Do you know they have to pay an interest penalty to the affected subcontractor, computed at the interest penalty rate of 1.5% per month? All right. So, you don't get paid, you submit your bill, you attack your interest provision to it. The contractor's obligated to give that to you. You're contractually entitled to that as a subcontractor. All right, and we tell you how to assess it. If the contractor doesn't comply with certification, i.e. they either falsified or they say they've paid and they haven't, KDOT can impose liquidated damages. That's an additional amount of $50 per calendar day penalty. If you report to me a subcontractor hasn't paid, because the subcontractor gives me a certification, right? And the contractor says, I've paid everybody. Or the contractor may say, again, we'll talk about good cause, I've paid everybody except for ABC company. All right, disclosed, we ask about it, we'll get to good cause. But if he does that, says everybody's been paid, and he doesn't list ABC, and ABC hasn't been paid, and ABC calls me, I mean, I'm gonna say, okay, well, contractor, you either falsified your certification. You did falsify your certification because you said everybody had been paid. Why did you falsify the certification? And then why hasn't payment been made? All right, so if the contractor, this is a serious enough provision, and when a contractor consistently fails to pay promptly or has problems with payment, we can actually affect, this can affect the contractor's qualification rating. It can affect how much business they do with KDOT. All right, because we pre-qualify contractors. And so depending upon their size, depending upon their resources, their equipment, they get so much dollar value of work they can do. But we can adjust that rating based upon the contractor's failure to pay promptly, because this is a really important provision. It's an important from a policy standpoint as well as a legal standpoint. And so we take it very seriously. But again, as a subcontractor, you have to know you have those protections in place. And our obligation as the owner to say, this is how I'm going to enforce this prompt pay requirement of federal law and state law, and Federal Highway has approved the sanctions KDOT put in place. But the sanctions were in our discretion, but they've been approved. But that's there for your benefit. But again, if you don't know it, you can't say, the certification can't say I paid and the check's there, but it never gets mailed. I've had it, because when we get an issue of payment, when I have a subcontractor that says I haven't been paid, and we investigate that, which we do, because we administer the funds, we administer the contract, we say, prove to me you paid. And that's like, and then, well, here's a check. No, the check has to go through. You have to show me that you delivered the check. Because, yeah, you could have written a check and then not mailed it for, a month. So that's the kind of thing we look at. So I just want you to be aware of the prompt pay requirement, as well as the protection you as a subcontractor would have if you don't get paid promptly. Now, if you are a prime, I want you to be aware that what? You have the obligation to pay promptly. And if you don't, you can have sanctions as well. But guess what? Even if you are not the prime, if you are a subcontractor and you subcontract out work to someone else, guess what? If you go to the next section, 109.8, it will tell you lower tier subcontractors also have to be paid promptly. All right, so it's not just a contract requirement. If you are a subcontractor and you're subcontracting, you also have an obligation to pay promptly, according to the contract. So, any questions about prompt pay or the failure to pay promptly? Or why that's there, or why it's needed. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about, though, on that issue, because I skipped it, and I shouldn't have, is good cause. What is good cause for not paying? You have not been paid, and the contractor says to KDOT on their certification, I didn't pay ABC company.
Well, it could be maybe they didn't use the right materials they were supposed to use, or it could be that they poor service or didn't put it in properly.
There's a constructability issue.
Haven't received the certifications.
If you're waiting on certification, materials certifications. So you can't pay for that until you have the certification in place to know that what? It's in compliance with the specs, all right? So there is a good cause exception that says if the contractor has good cause to withhold a progress payment, all right, identify the cause on the certification, the payment amount, and the anticipated payment date. Writing this information on the certification. If the engineer determines, who's the engineer? KDOT. If we determine the contractor has good cause, then there's no penalty, there's no sanction. We're not going to assess the liquidated damages. There's no interest owed, because there are times when there is a payment dispute. And primarily it should relate to something like a constructability issue. Now, we're looking at this project, not another project. So contractors before say, well, I didn't pay them because they owe me money on the city project over here. No, this contract is good cause for this contract and your performance here. If you want to sue them on another project, that's fine. We're administering this contract. But the good cause exception does exist. It's there. And while KDOT is not going to get in the middle of a good faith dispute between a contractor and a subcontractor, that's not our role. Our role is to administer federal law, our contract, payments, and make sure things are above board. So we're not going to get involved in a good faith dispute, but we're going to evaluate it to make sure what? It really is a good faith dispute. So we're not just going to accept the certification that's there. Now, another change that's been made that you need to know about, at least in the KDOT realm, is we now have our new civil rights software. And you do your certification with respect to payment, and it will only let you track and put in certification information for subcontractors, people who actually perform services. So if you have a supplier, you do not include that information in the certification because the system just physically won't let you do it. Now, does that mean that there is no obligation to pay suppliers promptly? No, there is not, because if you look at that contract provision, the very first one, right, what does it define as a subcontractor? It is a person, it is an entity who performs what? Services, supplies materials, equipment, labor, anything done on that project through the contractor. So yes, contractor, you don't have to certify to me that you promptly pay, but guess what? The penalty provision says if you don't comply with 109.6, you get sanctions. And what does 109.6 require? Payment within 10 days. The payment within 10 days exists independent of the certification requirement. The certification requirement is just another mechanism by which it's paperwork, that we enforce it and that we monitor it. But it does not mean that the contractor only has to pay promptly subcontractors and there's no sanction if you don't pay suppliers timely. So, any questions on prompt pay?
Is there any requirements on, I know that we can send in stored material, but is there any, if I have a supplier that wants to be paid, can they request payment on a KDOT job sooner than I receive payment?
They can request,
But I'm not obligated to.
no. It's what your subcontract agreement says. So you're the prime. Your contractual obligation to KDOT and what we require is you to pay within the 10 days of receiving payment from KDOT. Now, I'll make a clarification. Say I don't pay you, say the pay estimate would be $500,000, but I withheld $50,000 liquidated damages, so you only get $450,000. I paid you for the work that was done. Your prompt payment obligation to the subcontractor would still be the total amount. Okay, but other than that type of situation, that situation, again, would include the prompt pay for 10 days until it is paid when paid. You can contract something else. Keep in mind, when I talk about our contract provision, if you are a prime contractor with KDOT, the provision does give you protection as a subcontractor because, again, federal law, my contract says this is the contractor's obligation. But as a subcontractor, you are not a party to the KDOT contract. You cannot sue KDOT for something that was done on the project because in Kansas, you can't sue me for breach of contract if you're not a party to the contract, and unless I make you a specific third-party beneficiary to the contract, which, of course, I have a provision that says there's no third-party beneficiaries. But I still have protected you in the subcontract agreement, in this contract agreement. I've still said you're entitled to that interest. If you don't get paid, I can take action against the contractor to enforce that requirement because we're enforcing, federal law. If you as a contractor enter into subcontracts that give greater protection to the subcontractor or impose additional requirements that are not required of you as a prime on a KDOT contract, that's your right to do that. You cannot, however, modify my contract and offer less protection. So you could not say, I'm going to agree to pay you within 20 days instead of 10 days subcontract. That would be a violation of our contract, and that would not be enforceable. If you said, I'm going to pay you subcontractor in 5 days of getting payment from KDOT, not 10 days, you can do that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and I'm not going to be, and if you don't, I'm not going to get involved because that's the contract between the two of you. Again, our job is not to get in the middle of negotiated terms between contractors and subcontractors. But as a subcontractor, I encourage you, whether you are working on a KDOT contract, a city contract, vertical contract, whatever you're doing, know that prime contract because there are provisions in that contract, I guarantee you, that will affect you. There are provisions in that contract that you can take advantage of. And a lot of times, the majority of the times in a subcontract agreement, Have you read do you have what's called a flow down provision? Do you have a provision in your subcontract agreement that says the terms of the prime contract are part of this contract? You should read and look at that. Because if it does, then I have provisions in this contract that require the contractor. Remember that lower tier subcontract payment said you have to include this in your subcontract agreements. So there are certain provisions I say you contractor have to include this in your subcontract agreement. Other provisions I don't. But if the subcontract agreement incorporates all the terms of the prime contract in it, again, there are obligations that you have as a subcontractor, the same way the contractor has the obligation to KDOT. There's protections you may have. There may be benefits that you have as a subcontractor, the same type of benefit that the contractor has when they're making a claim against KDOT. So you really need to be you need to be aware of what your contract says, what your subcontract agreement says, and what the prime contract agreement says. Because, again, it just, well, you'll see some of the things we're going to talk about. I mean, it will become very apparent why you should know about this. So, let's see.
And along those lines, Carmen, I know that Federal Highway very much wants the Federal Highway Form 1273. If you are a prime, it needs to physically be included in your subcontract. We include it in our contract with the
Yes.
prime, and that needs to be passed down to the sub. So if you are a prime, you need to make sure that's in there.
So where do you get that?
It will, if you are the prime, a copy will be given to you.
Oh, okay.
And if you are a sub, a copy should be given. But you can always go to the Federal Highway website and just type in Form 1273, and
Okay.
it talks about payroll and various other things.